The outside thing that you see and the inside thing that you are poles of the same magnet, or back and front of the same coin, and without one there isn't the other. That means, of course, then, that we are living in the midst of a world of animals, vegetables, minerals, atmospheres, astronomical bodies, that's highly intelligent. Its intelligence is, as it were, concentrated, crystallized in our brains. That's where it comes out in any field. Let's say, let's take any field of forces. We take a sort of chemical solution.
Hamoud, welcome back, man.
In this chemical solution, the crystals start to form. And so in the same way, the total intelligence of this whole universe crystallizes in human brains. Also in other kinds of brains. But that's where it really comes out. But it's the total intelligence of the whole field that does this. So we go with the whole thing, interdepend with it. We don't live in an environment which is just rock, just air, just atmosphere and so on. It's only, the environment's only like that when we think about it in a certain way. When we think about it analytically and try to explain it. But when we think of, it isn't just rock and air, see, but it's air, rock, it's, those things go together. When you see the interconnectedness, when you see in the simplest way how flowers go with bees and other insects, they don't live without them. Humans go with cattle, they don't exist without them. Plants, etc., etc., etc. When you see the intervals, the significance of the relationships between these things, it's only then when you see that you are aware of the melody. Go back to the illustration I gave of the person who can't hear melody, who's tone deaf. He hears only a succession of sound because he's not aware of the intervals. Now, most people are brought up to be tone deaf in respect to their own existence and the rest of the universe. They don't see the relationships. They're not aware of the unity. And so, once you spot that, you spot how everything goes with the thing, but you are one end and that out there is the other end. And they really go together. Then you may be said to be living a harmonious life. In exploring the theme of the web of life, I have thus far discussed two principal topics. First, yesterday morning, the web considered as selectivity, life experience considered as what we pay attention to on the one hand and what we ignore on the other. And I showed how the way in which we pay attention to the world creates, isolates, I'm using that as a noun, isolates, that we call particular things, events, and persons, and they seem to be disconnected and to be alone because we ignore the connections between them. And I used the analogy of weaving where the threads go underneath and join on the back in a way that is not seen on the front. So you might say in the unconscious, although I don't particularly like that word, because it makes it seem as if it was something rather dead. But on the unconscious side of life, as on the back of the weaving or the back of the embroidery, there are connections which are not published. I'm going further into that this morning. Now, in the second part of the theme was the web as mutuality. That was yesterday afternoon, when I discussed the way the existence of a web, the existence of cloth or anything like that, depends on a mutual support of the warp and the woof. And this miraculous thing occurs that when the things support each other, being comes into being, cloth comes into being. And so in exactly the same way, our world is a manifestation of relativity. And this requires a balance, a combination, a relationship of opposites in every domain of life. And although these opposites are explicitly different and even antagonistic, they are implicitly one. And that's the secret. See, these two secrets that we went into. The connection between what are supposed to be separate things and events, and the mutual unity between what are manifestly, that is to say openly, for purposes of publication, opposites. Now this morning and this afternoon I'm going to take two other aspects of the web. I mentioned one rather briefly yesterday. The web is a trap. Like the spider's web is a trap for flies. Also, the lovely embroideries are worn by women as traps for men from a certain point of view. And this afternoon I want to consider the web as something playful. You see, there are so many ways of looking at it. And you will find that all these ways are right. But what we need is the fullness of the view. There are people, for example, who can see the web as a trap and get stuck with that. There are people to whom existence is simply hateful. They see it as nothing but a ghastly mistake. The Lord really erred when he created this world, because he arranged it in such a way that everything lives by eating something else. And there isn't really, what I'm doing is I'm describing a certain point of view, you see. I'm not exactly philosophizing, I'm describing a point of view. You can look at life in such a way that the whole thing is this ghastly mistake. For example, there is no such thing as genuine kindness or love. Everybody is really pretending that they're loving other people in order to get some advantage from them. And indeed, there is a point of view which occurs in certain forms of paranoia, where people don't seem to be real. They are mechanisms. And you can think that out quite intensely with a good deal of intelligence. After all, if you start from a good old Darwinian or Freudian basis and see that man is a material machine and that the consciousness of man is simply a very, very involved and complicated form of chemistry, and that's what it is, you see, well, then these awful mechanical things, these Frankensteins that everybody is, they come around and they say, well, I'm alive. I'm a human being. I have a heart. I love, I hate, I have problems, I feel. And you feel like saying, come off it. You're just a monster. And you put on this civilized act because really you're just a set of teeth on the end of a tube. And you've got a ganglion behind those teeth, which you call your brain or your alleged mind. And this thing is really basically there for two purposes. One, to be cunning enough to get something to eat, to put down the tube, and the other is, you know what, Mr. Freud's libido. And that's the other thing. And everything else, you see, can be construed as an elaborate, subtle way of pretending that that's not really what you want to do. But you do. But you put on a great show. Now, some people, according to this theory, according to this view, get mixed up. They so repress that what they really want to do is to eat and to screw, that they get involved in higher things that are the masks for these activities, and think that that's the real purpose of life. And then they become what's called neurotic. And so because they get involved in being pure camouflage. So that's what's called escaping from the facts, not looking at life, not looking at reality correctly. Now, this is a very strange thing, you see, that it is partly true that the universe, so far as its biological aspect is concerned, is this weird system that lives by everybody eating everybody else. Only what we do to maintain what is called order and civilization is that various species make agreements, as it were, that they won't eat each other. They'll cooperate, and so be an enormous gang which can beat down the others. So the human being is the most successful so far of this gangster arrangement. We are the most predatory monsters on Earth. And we have cooperated to assault the fish and the vegetables and the chickens and the cows and everything, you see? Only we do it by not letting our left hand know what our right hand doeth. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, unless gentlemen happen to be prone to going hunting as a sport, they don't see their food killed. They don't see the slaughterhouse. And so it's all what you get in the butcher, in the market. A steak, you know, is a thing in its own right. It has nothing to do with a cow. A steak is a thing shaped thus and so, and it looks as if it might be like a banana or something like that, you know, and nobody worries. And when a fish is served up, it does indeed look like a fish, but it's not the squiggly, squirmy fish that comes out on the end of the fish's line. You know, when you really fish, you realize that the fish doesn't like it very much. Now, there is that absolutely extraordinary side of things that is really terrifying. And so, let me repeat the illustration I used of the cross in the net, where one side of it is scissors that cut and eat, teeth that chew and get this thing in, and the opening side of it is like James Joyce's in Ulysses, the girl who says yes, and I said yes, yes, yes. She wants to be absolutely ravaged by her man, you see. So it's open, open, open. But now comes if we take the dark view of things, the horrible view, excuse me if I go into some rather grisly details, but have you ever heard of a vagina dentata? That is the idea that in the sexual organ of the woman there are teeth. And a lot of men have this fantasy, and so are rendered impotent. They don't make love, because they feel that the price of this blessed experience, this creative experience, this loving experience, is you're going to get trapped. You're going to get emasculated. You're going to lose your precious member. And this is a very ancient fantasy. It appears throughout all known history. Because, you see, this is simply the woman's come up, where she attracts, but she's out really to get you. She is basically a spider mother, you see, who is selfish and doesn't really love you. Not really, but says she does. And, of course, there are, on the other side, all the tricks of the men. Go without mention. So, this is a view of the world as a system of mutual exploitation and of maximal selfishness. Now, it's a very profitable view to explore. Everybody should do in their lifetime sometime two things. One is to consider death, to observe skulls and skeletons, and to wonder what it will be like to go to sleep and never wake up. Never. That is a very gloomy thing for contemplation, but it's like manure. Just as manure fertilizes the plants and so on, so the contemplation of death and the acceptance of death is very highly generative of creative life. You get wonderful things out of that. And the other thing to contemplate is to follow the possibility of being, of the idea that you are totally selfish. That you don't have a good thing to be said for you at all. You are a complete, utter rascal. Now,
Thank you, man. Glad you like what you see.
Episcopalian form of confession.
A little slow today, but
that we have erred and strayed from thy ways like lost sheep, and we have followed too much the devices and desires of our own hearts. Too much. We have offended against thy holy laws. We have undone those things which we ought to have done, and we have done those things which we ought not to have done. And there is no health in us. But it ought to be different. And we're going to do our best to amend with the help of God's grace. And that is a real con act. Because, we'll go into that. So you find in that sense of the word, if you equate health with genuine love and perfect unselfishness, then in that sense there is no health in us when we look at ourselves from this point of view. Now, when you go deeply into the nature of selfishness, what do you discover? You say, I love myself, I seek my own advantage. Now, what is the self that I love? What do I want? And that becomes an increasingly ever-deepening puzzle. Now, I've often referred to this when you say to somebody else, I love you. It's always rather disconcerting to the person to whom you say that. If you imply that you love them with a pure, disinterested, and holy love, they automatically suspect it as being a little bit phony. But if you say, I love you so much I could eat you, that's an expression, it's a way of saying to a person, you attract me so much that I can't help it. I'm absolutely bowled over by you. I'm gone. And people like that. Then they feel they're really being loved, that it's absolutely genuine. But now, I love you so much I could eat you. Now what the devil do I want? I certainly don't want to eat the girl in the sense of literally devouring her, because then she'd disappear. But I love myself. And what is me? In what way do I know me?
Hey Rosh, how you doing?
Well, it suddenly occurs to me that I know me only in terms of you. See, when I think of anything that I know and that I like, then it's always something that can be viewed as other than me. I can never get to look at me, real me.
Thank you. No, you're totally good.
And I don't.
Yeah, I'm trying to get more interactive on here.
Maybe I don't. Maybe it's an appalling mess. But certainly the things I do and that I want from a selfish point of view, when I really think about them, they're all something else that's in a way outside me. Now, we saw yesterday, you see, that there is a reciprocity, a total mutual interdependence between what we call the self and what we call the other. That's the warp and the woof. And so, if you are perfectly honest about loving yourself, and you don't pull any punches, you don't pretend that you are anything other than exactly what you are, you suddenly come to discover that the self you love, if you really go into it...
All right, have fun, Rosh. Thanks for stopping by and saying hello.
You don't like all of it. You're selective about it, as we saw in the beginning.
I'm very good. Thanks for asking. Yeah, let's catch up soon.
But on the whole, you love yourself in terms of what is other. Because it's only in terms of what is other that you have a self at all. So then, I feel that one of the very great things that C.G. Jung contributed to mankind's understanding was the concept of the shadow. That everybody has a shadow. And that the main task of the psychotherapist is to do what he called to integrate the evil. To, as it were, put the devil in us in its proper function. Because you see, it's always the devil, the unacknowledged one, the outcast, the scapegoat, the bastard, the bad guy, you see, the black sheep of the family. It's always from that point, which we could call the fly in the ointment, you see, or the speck in the egg, that generation comes. In other words, in the same way as in the drama, to have the play, it's necessary to introduce a villain. It's necessary to introduce a certain element of trouble. So, in the whole scheme of life, there has to be the shadow, because without the shadow there can't be the substance. So this is why there is a very strange association between crime and all naughty things and holiness. Meaning, where we consider holiness, you see, holiness is way beyond being good. Good people aren't necessarily holy people. A holy person is one who is whole, who has, as it were, reconciled his opposites. And so there's always something slightly scary about holy people. And other people react to them in very strange ways. They can't make up their minds whether they're saints or devils. And they are very ambivalent towards them. And so holy people have throughout history always created a great deal of trouble, along with their creative results. Take Jesus, for example. Trouble that Jesus created is absolutely incalculable. Think of the Crusades, the Inquisition, heaven only knows what's gone on in the name of Jesus. Very remarkable. Freud's a big troublemaker. as well as a great healer, you see. It all goes together. So the holy person is scary, because he is like the earthquakes, or better still, he's like the ocean. See the ocean on a lovely sunny day, you can say, oh, isn't that gorgeous, and you can go into it and relax and float around. But boy, when the storm comes, does that thing get mad? Terrifying. So there is in us the ocean, you see. And Jung felt that the whole point was to bring the two together, and by a kind of a fantastic honesty, to penetrate one's own motivations to the depths. But Jung had a tremendous humor. And he knew that nobody can be completely honest. That you will try and you'll have a great deal of success in exploring your motivations and your dark, unconscious depths. But there will be a certain point at which you will say, well, I've had enough of that. You know? And, do you see how, in a strange way, there's a certain sanity in that? When a person indulges in a certain kind of duplicity, of deception, there is something, you all laughed when I said that, there's something humorous about it. And this humor is a very funny thing. Basically, humor is an attitude of laughter about oneself. There is malicious humor, or which is laughing at other people. But real deep humor is laughter at oneself. Now, why fundamentally do you laugh about yourself? What makes you laugh about yourself? Isn't it because you know that there is a big difference between what goes on the outside and what goes on the inside? That if I hint, you see, that your inside is the opposite of your outside, it makes people laugh. If I don't do it unkindly. If I get up in the attitude of a preacher and say, you're a bunch of miserable sinners and you ought to be different, nobody laughs. But if I say, well, after all, boys will be boys and girls will be girls, and we all know, then people laugh. Now, you see, what's happening when we do that? Now, I passed you around a lot of embroidery to look at before we started. And I'm perfectly sure that you got the point. That there's a big difference between the front and the back. In some forms of embroidery, the back is very different from the front because people take shortcuts. In the front, everything... with a gasoline engine. But it's going to be very difficult to get rid of it because people want to sell oil. Or because machine tools would have to be completely made over. It would be terribly difficult for the industry to change. Therefore, we get anachronisms, which blind us to ingenuity and ability to see what could be done instead. You may think that sounds communistic. It isn't at all, because nothing is more of an anachronism than a bureaucracy. A collectivist state, in other words, is the most hopeless thing to change, because nobody has any responsibility. It is not organic, it's a monolithic machine. That's the pattern that we see in so-called communist countries. And they have just as tough a time producing an innovation as we do. We have to think of new political ideas altogether, ideas that have never been heard of. But the way of thinking about politics, as of thinking about techniques, is by an organic model instead of a mechanical model. The world has one body, but a body, you see, is a highly diversified system with all kinds of division and function, and yet all one. It is not like an anthill. It's much more differentiated. And that is the human image as distinct from, say, the insect image or the machine image. The problem I was discussing this morning was really the relationship of ecology to technology, but I was discussing it in a historical way, raising the problem of why technology originated in the West and not, for example, in China, and showing, first of all, that those people in China who did make some progress in the study of nature, the Taoists, thought about the world in accordance with a different model than people in the West, a model that did not immediately permit of technological development. The West thought about nature by analogy with mechanics, with machines. The Chinese thought about nature by analogy with organisms. A machine is something which can be taken apart and reordered, something which is the product of an act of engineering, and is therefore an organization with a governor. An organism is not made piecemeal. It grows and doesn't have a governor. All the parts in an organism are in an orderly anarchy. That is to say, they govern themselves. And the Chinese word for nature, zhiran, means that which is so of itself. Therefore, that which functions without being pushed around by some external force. It is automatic, but not as we mean the word automatic. We mean a self-governing machine. And there's a certain difference here. So the problem then is, if the Chinese, viewing the world as an organism, felt on the whole that it was wiser to restrain one's interference with things, that is to say, there are certain situations in which the human being should simply lay hands off. There are other situations in which the human being collaborates with nature, but he does so by virtue of having great awareness of the field of forces in which he is situated. This takes us back, of course, to the point that I made right at the beginning, that you really are the field of forces in which your organism is situated. Self-realization is, in fact, realizing as a sensuous experience that you are that field of forces, that you are both your outside and your inside, which of course leads us to something that we can experience but cannot define. And we can't define it for two reasons. One is it's too complicated. And another reason is, even deeper than that, it leads us to the root and ground of reality. That is to say, I'm only speaking in analogical terms, the continuum in which all things exist, which can't be thought about as an object because it can't be classified. You can't say anything really meaningful about it at all. But it's tremendously important to know that you're it. That's the real you, because if you don't know that, you go crazy. you become dementedly absorbed in details, identifying yourself with a purely temporal and indeed in somewhat respects arbitrary role which you're playing. And you forget that even if you do lose your shirt in this game, it doesn't matter in this round, because at that level there's no winner and no loser. So the question we come to now is, well, how do you go about knowing the field of forces in which you live? How do you know which way the wind is blowing so that you can sail properly, when it isn't as simple a matter as wetting your finger and holding it up and see which side gets cold first? That's where the wind's coming from. Or is it as simple as that? We know, or think we know, that nature is extraordinarily complicated, and so very difficult to understand. And if you can't understand a very complicated situation, it's immensely difficult to make decisions about it. But there is a point of view from which nature is not complicated, and that, to an educated Westerner, may sound quite astonishing. When Buddhists speak in their philosophy about the world of form and the world that is formless, these two categories correspond roughly to the world as complicated and the world as simple. What makes the world complicated is not its actual physical structure, but an attempt to understand it in a certain way. When you ask, how does it work? Why does it do it? Then you start analyzing a flower, a body, a geological structure, and you are asking the question, really, how can I reproduce in words or numbers what is going on? In such a way that I can predict what it will do next. Now, the trouble with words and numbers is that they have some peculiar limitations. It takes time to read. It takes longer still to listen to a tape recording. And to scan a mathematical expression, again, it is something strung out in the line, and you have to think carefully to understand the various steps which have been taken. So, these are methods of breaking down the phenomena of nature into a code. These codes can be handled by computers with astonishing speed. But the part of the human mind which we are mainly concerned with, which is the conscious mind, can only handle them very slowly. Because the conscious mind has to work in terms of symbols, verbal and mathematical, which are really very clumsy. So that by the time we have really thought about something, it's usually too late to do anything about it. The circumstances have changed. The crisis about which we had to make a decision has already happened. And therefore we have to act without the kind of preparation we think we ought to have and without the kind of knowledge we think we ought to have. Because we cannot comprehend the world in verbal patterns. As a result of that, we always feel frustrated. We think we're supposed to comprehend
Oh, hey, Skylar.
and manage it that way. And a lot of people
It's
are
been a
not
while.
satisfied until you've given them an explanation.
Glad you can join.
But it should be obvious that there never will be an explanation.
Not to mention the only person
In the
who's
terms
joining.
of words. The simplest object in the world forever, and not fully describe its attributes. Words have a use, but they only have that use when they are operating in subordination to a kind of understanding that doesn't depend on words at all. Words are like claws on the end of an arm.
How do you like the artwork?
And the claws are no good unless subordinate to the more subtle organization of the arm and the rest of the body. So words are claws in which we tear life and arrange it in certain ways.
No, I'm just stealing Frazetta's work.
Right, and therefore separate the bits of a piece of meat in order to digest them. So to make the world digestible in a certain way, you need to claw it apart. But actually, we do all kinds of acts of understanding along with words, which are not contained in the words. A person, to get your point, does many non-verbal...
You don't have to stay, though.
For example, to read a book requires that I be able to see. And seeing is a non-verbal operation. When you try to use words, you come up against barriers of all kinds. It is a very difficult thing to describe. But that's only because you are trying to describe it in a difficult way. It's the same problem if you want to unload the bathtub as the drain is stopped, and you take out the water with a fork. It will take forever. But if you bring in a pail, it will be a lot faster. And there is something in trying to describe in words that is rather like trying to move water with a fork. It is efficient, in other words, for some purposes.
What are you doing?
But words, again, I point out, they communicate
Catch.
only to those who already know what you mean. To him that hath shall be given. And for that reason they're convenient, because then we can remind each other in common by words of things that we already know. But water as a word means nothing to people who haven't experienced water. Once they have experienced it, the word is useful because it's like using money instead of barter. I can discuss water with you without having to bring some into the room and show it to you. So words provide this kind of a shorthand. And very much, in so many ways, they have the advantages and the disadvantages of money. Money helps us to transfer wealth. Words help us to organize experience and communicate about it with each other. But beyond that, when we try to put our experience into words, and in terms of words comprehend experience, then we run into insuperable difficulties. Not so long ago, a professor at Harvard, in discussing the heresy of certain members of the faculty who were conducting experiments in terms of changed states of consciousness, said that no knowledge is academically respectable knowledge which cannot be put into words. I don't know what became of the Department of Physical Education at that point, but or not to mention fine arts and things like that, and music. But still, this is what he said. That's what lots of people feel, people who are in the scientific and technological world. But obviously is a type of intelligence that is not verbal or computational intelligence. The eye, the brain, the organization of a plant are obviously intelligent. What do I mean, intelligent? I say they're obviously intelligent because anyone can see it. I would even go so far as to say they are not products of intelligence. As if some intelligent fellow had been around and left this as a kind of track of his competence. The growth of a plant is intelligence itself. And intelligence is naturally something that in words would always escape definition, in the same way as the nervous system upon which intelligence depends is incomprehensible even to the neurologist. We know intelligence when we see it, because we say it's fascinating. My, isn't that tricky? How ingenious. What a wonderful organization. How beautiful. And we recognize in the patterns of nature that this is happening. So when you see a human being and you say, what a piece of work is man. This is extraordinary. The beauty of the eyes, the marvelous organization and coordination of the limbs. But then you realize that this is you. But you don't know how you work it, and you do work it. So what it comes to is this, that in your total organization and nervous system, you are expressing a kind of intelligence that is, when looked at from the point of view of conscious analysis, unthinkably complex. And yet, from its own point of view, it's perfectly simple. Because you don't have to make an effort to see. You just see. You don't have to make an effort to hear. The ear does it for you. You don't have to make an effort to hold yourself together. The body holds you together. You do have to make an effort to get food. Sometimes to keep warm. Sometimes to defend yourself. So some effort is always involved. And in a certain way, the heart, for example, which we don't think about, it does work. And it consumes energy. But you don't have the sensation of making a decision every time your heart beats. Some who see people who are studying music probably the wrong way have to make a decision every time they play a note so as to stay on time and to play the right note. And then they get absolutely worn out because it's decision after decision after decision. And there's nothing more wearing than that. Because with every decision goes anxiety. Was it the right decision? There is no way of avoiding that. Because if you are going to decide with the ordinary responsible way of making decisions that we are supposed to do, you never know whether you made a right decision or not until the event about which you've decided is passed. Because you never know how much information you need to collect to make the right decision, whether you did indeed collect enough, and whether the information you collected was relevant. And also you realize that every possible decision can be radically affected by unforeseeable variables such that you've completed a contract with a business corporation and everything is in order, but you had no means of knowing that the president of that corporation, upon whom you depended, was going to slip on a banana skin and have a serious accident. There would be no way whatsoever of foreseeing that eventuality. Should you have taken out an insurance policy on it? How comprehensive can an insurance policy be? Is it worth taking out an insurance policy? What are the chances of unforeseen events occurring of such significance and in such number that this sort of insurance policy is worthwhile and you're not just wasting money on paying the premiums? In the long run, all insurance is a swindle. You should read Ambrose Bierce's book, The Devil's Dictionary. He has the most subtle and extremely logical demolition of insurance. But in the short run, in a kind of chancy way, you see it sometimes pays off. But you see, this is the problem, the anxiety with which we are faced in trying to conduct our lives by the exercise of conscious will and control. We realize that it is really beyond our comprehension. We don't understand. We cannot foresee all eventualities. And therefore, this sense of frustration through trying to control things gives us a feeling of existence.
What's funny, Hamoud?
Thousands of years, men have called the fall. And the idea that there has been a fall, that something has been lost, is universal and very ancient. In the Taoist literature of China, there are constant references to a sort of golden age.
No, I'm just being silly, man.
Lao Tzu says, when the great Tao lost, in other words, when things did not always and automatically go in accordance with the course of nature.
Just messing with you. Thank you for coming again. The stream has been just like Lath and Hamoud hanging out.
6 family relationships fell apart. There was talk of filial sons and daughters and faithful wives. When ministers became corrupt, then only did one hear of loyal ministers and wise counselors. Now, therefore, when things have fallen apart, somebody gets up and starts preaching. And if there is one thing quite clear from history, it is that preaching does no one any good. It makes only hypocrites. Because if I tell you that you ought to be concerned, and you ought to be unselfish, and you ought to cooperate, and you ought to be responsible, and because I imply to you that you're not, you will, but in the first place, be resentful that I've had to tell you that. And you will feel guilty. But now you are under the impression that you really and indeed
Thank you.
a separate self.
Where do you live, Hamoud?
With the power to perform all these virtues.
It's like no matter
Go through the motion.
when I log in, you're always there. I appreciate it.
You are, in this case then, an egocentric and selfish person pretending that you aren't. And the truth will always out, because in the long run you'll let down the people who are relying on you to be what you're not. And we have the most subtle ways of letting people down, while
Ooh.
are doing exactly what they expect of us.
Where in KSA?
Yes, we can be so pure but so cruel, so loving but so demanding.
Oh, yeah.
Wise but so dull.
What school do you go to?
So that we take it out on others.
Oh, gotcha.
when we feel that we are forced into doing
I've never been to Jeddah, man.
against our own
I grew up in the KSA,
and we do that.
Saudi, but never in
We do
Jeddah.
our very best not to be confident,
It's like the one place I've never been to.
because that would puncture the whole balloon and show it up for a farce, and we can't afford that. So,
English medium school, that's cool. Is that typical in Jeddah, or
then this feeling of nostalgia,
are you special?
golden age, when we have the feeling that once upon a time, at some point, and this may refer back to
No, I grew up in Sharqiya.
refer back to life in the womb, it may refer back to primitive conditions before the invention of language and writing and numbers, but somehow there is a feeling
Like an hour from Bahrain.
we get, especially from contemplating animals. They don't worry very much. They don't, they seem to follow their nature. They don't seem to go through a decision-making process. Just as you don't go through a decision-making process when you sneeze, or when you breathe, or when you blink.
So why did you make the decision to go to an English school? I like it. I mean, it'll help you a lot when you go to college one day.
The thought occurs to us, would it not be possible to conduct our life in that way always?
Especially if you're going to go to college
And
abroad.
instead of making these pathetic decisions on the basis of utterly incomplete information, wouldn't there be some way in which we could manage to do the right thing? That is to say, to respond appropriately within the field of forces in which we are living and which we are, without these clumsy attempts to do so by force and by will. That, of course, is what Taoist philosophy is considering all the time. And it is trying to point out that there is, in fact, a way of living like that. Only nobody will believe it because they're scared out of their wits that it won't work. And of course, you have to ask all sorts of questions as to what you mean by work.
Okay.
But surely it should be obvious.
Yeah, I streamed on Twitch for a little while, but
Intelligent enough to be able to see.
it was just as quiet as here.
Isn't there just the faint possibility that the kind
I
of
didn't do it for too long, but
which enables you
I had 2 cameras set up and everything too, but not a lot of people showed up.
to be of use if it could be
I
canalized
still don't have a lot of. When I have
as well.
when I have more requests, I will go back to Twitch, but do a lot of digital artwork there too.
The human brain is not a muscle.
Yeah, they told me I have to like be active for at least
Private like a computer.
12 days
Which
before
does not think,
shadow bans can be lifted. So
but thinks
trying to do this now for a while.
in terms of neurological operations.
I like that, man. I like that your parents are looking out for you.
Conscious. That is to say, they are never attended to in detail. That's what conscious.
Yeah, Twitch is mostly for gaming too. A lot of people get attention through gaming.
In other words, that thinking
I had a YouTube channel too. I had some stuff there a long time
is
ago,
all
but
part of thinking is a verbal process.
I post process videos of digital art there too. But
But it's a highly organized process.
you gotta be consistent if you want growth. So,
Words is a very, very
and I'm not, because I have a day job
and it's the simplest thing in the world to do it. Because you don't
and I don't want to like
what do you mean by simple?
do this just for an audience. I do a lot of stuff for my own entertainment. So
Now
I don't have a lot of energy to
so
do the videos right.
I have called
But
so completely blue in the face.
I don't know. Maybe that's just laziness. One day.
It seems so to him, anti-intellectual, undermining the whole nature and dignity of the academic professions, and so forth. But really and truly,
Yeah, hopefully.
if human beings are
If not, I'm gonna just take your suggestion and
increasingly
open
which they are creating.
another account.
Isn't it possible?
I have like 800 people and my posts only get seen by 100. I don't understand it.
Really trusting ourselves.
It's very weird.
Using ourselves to the full to come to an understanding of our problems.
It's getting a little bit better though, as the more I'm doing this. So I'll just continue to do this.
He'll do it. He'll think it out. He knows.
That's why I'm doing it even when nobody's on, because I'm trying to
You to do it.
just make a habit of it.
If you have started out with a definition of yourself, which really has very little to do with you at all, which is this kind of a joke that you are an ego and that you some sort of being inside a bag.
Yeah, it's very meditative actually. It is very calming.
Or at least supposed to be.
So what do you like to do, Hamoud,
As the chauffeur in charge of the car or the engineer who makes the machine?
besides going to school online right now?
If you knew how the whole thing was constructed, but the whole point is you don't. But if you could revive
There you go. I'm glad you know what ASMR is.
who you are,
Got Alan Watts talking here. It's kind of soothing.
are the field of forces with their patterning and with their incredible intelligence, and you trust yourself to decide. To respond, in other words, spontaneously to a situation, instead of going through this whole thing of what is the right thing to do. But you see, if you
ASMR though, that's a lifesaver. I don't sleep without ASMR these days.
to the doctrine of original sin,
Gaming, what games do you like to play?
you cannot possibly trust yourself. In fact, you see, what happens is this. We know that an airline pilot is a fallible being. And when he is driving a jet, things are happening much too fast for him to make up his mind if he has to make a decision. Therefore, increasingly, we put in all sorts of automated decision-making machines on a jet plane. Eventually, the pilot loses his confidence in himself, more and more, because he doesn't know how the damn thing works. He's just sitting there. And the famous story about the time when we have supersonic rockets.
FPC games, I don't know if I know what that is.
The tape recorder says, "You are now taking off for London, where we will be arriving in half an hour. All facilities on this aircraft are fully automated. There is no chance of human..."
I used to play a lot of like Uncharted and God of War and stuff like that.
But you see, we can do a rather good job in eliminating error by use of the computer in rather limited circumstances. Why? Because the computer, as it develops, is more like a nervous system,
Oh yeah, you don't play in PS4.
like a linguistic system.
Yeah, Horizon Zero Dawn and all that stuff. I've always had PlayStations all my life. I've never had anything else.
It is able to deal with ever so many operations at once and to synthesize them. And words can't do that. Words have to go along a single track. Now then if the brain
Hey Jacob, thank you for the like, man.
is still far more sophisticated than any computer we can yet construct, what is the limitation on human skill is that a human being isn't using his brain in the right way. He's not really using it to the full at all, except in some peculiar beings whom we call geniuses. And the funny thing about geniuses is they cannot explain...
Oh, you play on the on PS?
Here is a case in Zhuangzi's book of a wheelwright. He makes the most beautiful wheel.
Thanks, Jacob.
And the trick of a wheel is to get it to fit the axle. It mustn't be so loose that it wobbles, and it mustn't be so tight that it sticks. It has to have just the right thing. And he says, here I've been doing this for years, but I do not know how I do it, so I can't teach my son. And so I'm still working when I was 75 years old.
Oh, PC. Yeah, a lot of people do that. I've never played games on a PC.
Of all,
I don't know. Always seemed like. Can you still use your
they cannot explain how it's done.
like a console
This was my problem.
controller on a PC?
Because
I don't know. This might be a stupid question, but
around when I was 7,
I just can't. I don't. I know PCs are stronger computers, especially for gaming, which is ironic, but.
got terrible marks. And but at the same time, I was absolutely fascinated with the bookish process. I collected books. I loved books. I loved the smell of books. I loved
So what kind of controller do you use?
and but nobody really.
Or do you like? I don't know. I'm so archaic, man. I can't, when somebody tells me I play video games in a PC, I imagine them just using keyboards.
You know,
I'm like, I can't handle that.
this watch doesn't work. I said to the teachers, I want to work very badly, but how do you do it? They had no explanation. So I used to look at exemplars of intelligence, some of the teachers whom I admired, and I thought maybe I could find out how to do it by imitating the way they do their handwriting, or by wearing clothes the way they wear them, or by making the same sort of gestures, or by speaking in
Oh,
the
wow.
same way. That by some sort of sympathetic magic I would acquire.
That's pretty cool. Yeah, I can't imagine doing that. I'm very curious to see how that looks like. I'll look it up one day.
I remember from childhood again that our nurses in hospitals, sanitariums, or homes
Really?
had a very, very peculiar anxiety about constipation. In fact, that
And do you use like a big TV or just your regular computer like monitor?
not constipated.
That's the one thing that's great about a console. You
You
just,
had to do your duty, as they called it.
well, I guess you can hook up your PC to the living
You
room
didn't. There was
or a big monitor TV anyway.
It started with a concoction called California syrup of figs. It went next to a thing called Senna tea. It went next to cascara, finally to castor oil, which is the disgusting stuff. The trouble is that if they resort to that, you get back in a vicious circle because the whole muscular system is upset, and so you begin all over again. Now, the mistake that they all made was to issue a commandment to the conscious mind to achieve a result which the conscious mind is perfectly incapable of.
There we go. We're done.
The conscious mind has nothing to do with whether you're constipated. That has to do with the unconscious, or I prefer to call it the superconscious, because it's a lot more clever than the conscious mind is, and indeed a great deal more trustworthy. Only we don't believe that because we believe in original sin. And therefore the unconscious cannot be trusted. And if it wants to take a day off or so from going to the
That's cool, man. I'm glad that, and I know PCs are a lot stronger than consoles. Which is so ironic, but there we are.
You see, that was reflected in this rather trivial little illustration. Ran through everything. You must love us. You must be free. You must make the right decision. It's up to you. You've got to do it, see? Well, of course, as a result of that, one or two things happen. Most people simply lose their nerve. They realize, I've got to make the right decision, but I can't. Therefore, they drop out. They become the sort of people who just say, the whole thing is just too much, it's absurd. And they become low-grade intelligences or so, we think. Then there's another kind of people who grit their teeth, they pull themselves together, and they resolutely smash into this way of existence.
All right, good night, Hamoud.
And they get rewarded.
Thank you for coming. I'll see you tomorrow, I'm sure.
More power.
Good luck at school.
They succeed. succeeded in this game of being God. And so society rewards them, you see, by saying, well, you'll be president, you'll be this, you'll be that, you'll be the other thing. It looks fine, looks great, everything's going beautifully. But we've only seen the beginning of it. As it goes on, you say, well, we've got to control this, we've got to control that. You didn't think of that one before, did you? No, we can avoid a mistake if we get that up. We get this one fixed. And say, now wait a minute, I can't think about all that. We're going to hand all that problem to this computer. We'll keep an eye on that one for him and get that deciding about this. And so all these aids to intelligence come along. But at the center of it all is a guy who thinks he's in charge with his conscious intellect. And so soon, he begins to feel more and more responsible. And because he's making a mess anyhow, I mean, just imagine being the President of the United States. You don't know where you're going. You've got all these decisions to make. You haven't got any private life at all because there's a telephone here and a Secret Service man there and a secretary there and this and that. And here it goes. But whatever you do, it doesn't make the slightest difference. Whatever